doing? You hanging in there? Gone through quite a bit of information. We'll go through some anthropology. That's the nice long term for basically our family tree. When I was in high school, I took a great interest in genealogy in our family. And even today, I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, but sometimes when somebody comes up and meets me for the first time and they hear my name, they'll say, "Hey, are you related to such and such a Bailey?" Right? You know, I like to say, even if I've never heard of this person in my life, I'll say yes. Because we're all related, guys. We might be 147th cousins 17 times removed, but we are all related, all human beings, through Adam and Eve. It's just a question of how closely related we are. That's what that question's really about. And you know, when we look at the Bible, we find that genealogy is a pretty strong thing, pretty important theme, particularly in the Old Testament. But then we get into the New Testament, and this chart shows the genealogy of Jesus as recorded in Matthew and Luke, tracing Jesus' genealogy back as far as Abraham in the one case, and all the way back to Adam. Now, that's pretty significant. There's a reason that's in there, because you see, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. You may have heard that term before, probably in the book of Ruth and maybe elsewhere. The idea that somebody could be redeemed from their debts and get their land back and so forth by a close kinsman. And so Boaz was able to redeem Naomi's land, and he married Ruth out of that because he was a kinsman redeemer. And the same word that's used for kinsman redeemer there is used in Isaiah to refer to the Redeemer to come, Jesus Christ. He's our kinsman redeemer because, number one, he's fully God. He has to be fully God in order to atone for everybody's sin for all time, to potentially be the Savior for all who put their faith in him. And he's our kinsman because he too is related to Adam in the flesh. That's why that genealogy's there. If he's not our kinsman, then we can't be redeemed by him. That's why there could never have been any people that aren't related to Adam and Eve. Because you see, all creation was cursed by Adam's sin, right? All creation groans in Romans 8 because of that curse. And so if there was anybody ever that lived that was not related to Adam, then that would mean they'd be subject to that curse and die, but would not be eligible for the redemption through the kinsman redeemer because they're not related to Adam. Do you see the point? That's why we all come from Adam and Eve, and so did Jesus, fully God, but also fully man. Now, of course, we've already talked about this. There's another idea of genealogy out there. The idea that not only are we all related as human beings, but that all living things are related to one another through this evolutionary tree, all the way back to this single-celled common ancestor that Darwin speculated about. Right? He didn't know how horrendously complex even a single-celled organism is at the time. But that's the notion, that over deep time, that single cell evolved into various different things on this evolutionary tree so that we're related to animals and fish and trees. And so you may hear people suggesting that human beings are really no better than animals, or that their dog is every bit as important as a human being, right? You might hear that in the worldview. I don't mean to offend any pet owners, but the idea is we're created in the image of God, so there is something a little different in a human being than there is in a frog, all right? But if you follow this worldview, then the thinking goes a little bit different. Now, I actually came across evolution primarily in grade 11 history. Can you believe that? Ancient history class. And we started off by talking about something called prehistory. The idea is, history is what we can track as recorded events, things that people have spoken about and written down, or maybe it's engraved on some pottery somewhere, right? Human history, we can track that. And the Bible itself is history all the way from the very first verse. There's no such thing as prehistory in the Bible. But this other idea is that there was things that went on before human beings came along, and therefore that's called prehistory. And there's no record of it, except for an interpretation of the fossils. Now, in this class, we had a picture like this up on the wall. You seen that before? Or something like that. This idea that, this parade from some ape-like creature as we gradually evolved over time into things that were a little bit less ape-like and a little bit progressively more human. And we get things like Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon and Homo erectus and so forth, until eventually we get to modern man, Homo sapiens. Right? That's what that's supposed to represent, is that gradual transition over time. Now, in my first week in that class, we did an exercise designed to teach us about interpreting evidence at an archaeological site. And we were given a picture of some evidence at one of these sites somewhere in Africa. And some of the things we saw were this. We saw some footprints that looked obviously very human. We saw remnants of what might have been a cooking fire or a campfire of some kind. There's something had burnt there. We saw a rather rustic or primitive looking arrowhead at this site. We also found a large hollowed out half of an ostrich shell. All of these things were found at this site, that we were supposed to examine this evidence and interpret that and say, okay, how old is this? How long ago was there somebody here? Who was it? What was their lifestyle like? And we had that sitting on the wall looking at us. So we all started thinking in terms of some sort of primitive, prehistoric caveman, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, thousands, maybe even millions of years ago, right? That's the kind of things we started to say. Well, actually what this was is a campsite of a group of sand people known as you've probably heard of them as the Kalahari Bushmen. These are people that live in the present day in parts of Africa, and they still live a nomadic lifestyle. They hunt with bows and arrows. They make their own arrowheads. That's what we were witnessing in that site. But we had a way different interpretation, didn't we? Because we had some preconceived ideas in our head already before we saw that evidence. You can see the power of a worldview and those assumptions that come with it when looking at evidence. Now, for history, what we really want to do is take a look at what the Bible tells us. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." Obviously, human beings were not, according to this, human beings were not evolved out of some pre-human hominin, as the terminology there for some of those in-between transitional creatures that we've heard about, but created in the image of God right there on day 6. We go to Genesis 3 and we read that the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Again, reinforcing the idea that there are no people around not related to Adam. We all trace our lineage back to Adam and Eve, that first couple. And then we read through the next chapters and we find out they started having children. There's mention of Cain and Abel. And you probably remember that story of how Cain got jealous of Abel and he got so angry that he actually killed his brother. And then shortly after that, we hear of another son being born named Seth. And then we get into Genesis chapter 4 and how Cain goes to the land of Nod, and there's mention of Cain's wife. Well, wait a minute. How could Cain possibly have a wife at this point in time? All we've heard about is a few brothers. There's only one pair of parents. So who did Cain marry? Now, some would suggest he went to the land of Nod and, he found some ladies there and married one of the local girls. Doesn't actually say that. He could very easily have taken the wife with him. Okay? But the point is, there can't be any people in the world not related to Adam and Eve. So whoever this lady was, she had to be a fairly close relative to Cain. Well, now the skeptics are going to jump all over you and say, how does that make sense? Because you know what? God prohibits marrying a close relative. It's right there in Leviticus 18. Right? That's against God's law. How could Cain marry a sister or a niece or something like that? And we also know scientifically there's biological problems. If close relatives get married and have children, birth defects are apt to happen. And the more it happens generation after generation, the worse it gets. So if this happened back there, the idea is that, well, they should have gone extinct fairly quickly. So the Bible can't be right, according to the skeptics. Let's examine the biological problem. Why are there birth defects in this case? Well, we all have DNA. It's a molecule that contains all of the coded instructions to make you who you are. All right? And as our cells divide, our DNA gets copied over and over and over again. And eventually, copying mistakes or mutations happen in the DNA. And mutations, generally speaking, mess things up for the most part. Right? So you might get a mutation that messes up a particular gene. Now, these errors get passed on from one generation to the next. So you inherit the mutations that your parents had, plus they accumulate. It's been estimated that every generation receives probably about 100 more mutations than what their parents had. Right? And that just keeps accumulating over time. It's something called genetic load. The idea, think about it, your parents had so many mutations, you have probably 100 more than that, your children will have that plus another 100, and so on. This has stymied evolutionists for decades because they're thinking, if we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, we should be extinct by now. Works out a little bit better if we've only been around a few thousand years, by the way. But this is something that's well documented in genetics, that the mutations are accumulating in the human genome. So how does that fit into these birth defects? You get half your DNA from mom and half of it from dad. So you're going to get 2 copies of any given gene. And if you get 2 normal copies without mutations, everything's great. You might get one defective one from one parent with mutations in it, but as long as the other one's a normal one, you're okay. It's kind of like a backup copy. Where you run into problems is when you get mutations in the same gene from both parents and they line up, right? Now there's no backup. So if you think about it, if 2 close relatives marry and have children, they've already got very similar DNA from their parents, which means the mutations they have are probably lined up fairly similar to one another, which means there's a much greater chance of those mutations coming together and causing birth defects. And the more they accumulate, the more problematic it becomes. Now, it's not as big of a deal if you marry somebody you're more distantly related to, because there's less chance of those mutations lining up, although it does happen. So now, if they're accumulating, then that means if we crank the story back, there must have been fewer mutations in the past, right? How many do you suspect Adam and Eve had? Probably 0 at the start, maybe a few after the fall. They may have accumulated some in their lifetime. Mutations, by the way, are largely responsible for our bodies deteriorating over time. What about Cain's generation? How many? A few more? But probably not anywhere close to enough to be problematic, because we've got 3 billion base pairs of chemical letters in our DNA. So a few mutations at that point is insignificant. Not really a difficulty at all. In fact, see, God didn't actually prohibit marrying a close relative until the time of Moses. That's 2,500 years of world history. Through the bottleneck at the flood, through Noah and his family. But we know Abraham married a half-sister. God didn't say a word. Not until the time of Moses did he find it necessary to put a law in place. Because God's laws are practical. We know this ourselves. You got a small child, right? When our granddaughter was first born, she came over, she laid on the floor. We didn't have a lot of thou shalt nots, right? We didn't have a lot of rules because she couldn't go anywhere. Now she's a toddler, right? The gates have gone up, right? Now it's like, thou shalt not climb on the couch, thou shalt not beat on the cat, right? Yeah, that's a rule. Right? We know these things become more necessary, as it did for the nation of Israel many years later. As the mutations had accumulated, it became more necessary for a law to be put in place for our own good. And the same is true today. But not an issue in Cain's time. Let's go back to this idea here. We've probably all seen this. This idea that human beings have evolved from some ape-like creature a few million years ago, and all these hominins have happened. I wonder if there's any effects in people's thinking over time. We've already talked about some of that. Dr. William Provine from Cornell University, he said this: "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. And I must say that these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposeful forces of any kind, no life after death." This is what evolution teaches. "When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be completely dead. That's just all. That's going to be the end of me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either." How do you get up and out of bed in the morning with it? That's a pretty stark, dark worldview, isn't it, right? But it's perfectly logical if we all evolved by random chance from essentially nothing in the beginning, right? There's no God, there's no ethics, there's no morality really, right? No purpose in life. And he should know, because he was actually raised in the church as a youngster. Went off and studied by evolution. He taught evolutionary biology for many years. As far as we know, he died an atheist. Well, not now. You'll let that one sink in. Sad though that he lived. That's like, I mean, imagine the horror at discovering the truth in that next moment. So how do, this business of no ethics, how does this kind of thinking affect us? And we've already seen some statistics and some other rotten effects of evolutionary thinking. You've probably heard of various school shootings over the last several years, right? It seems to be a more common thing. You may not have heard of this one from Finland in 2007. A fellow went in and shot several people and killed 8 fellow students in his school. What's interesting is they found a YouTube video that he had posted shortly before that. His name is Pekka Erik Ovinen. And here's some of the things he had to say in that video before going into the school. "Life is just a coincidence, a result of long process of evolution. Human life is not sacred. Humans are just a species among other animals. Not all human lives are important or worth saving." Let that one sink in. "I cannot say that I am of the same race as this miserable, arrogant, and selfish human race. No, I have evolved a step higher." It's funny how evolutionists sometimes start thinking that way. "I, as a natural selector, will eliminate all who I see unfit, disgraces of the human race, and failures of natural selection." He thought he could just take evolution into his own hands. Now, that's a pretty stark example, and not everybody who believes evolution is going to do these sort of things, but you can see the logic. So we take a look at this, and this is the kind of thing, as I said, I got taught in history class, as prehistory, before we got into the Roman civilization and so forth. And we talked about a number of these different hominins that had been discovered and studied. And one of them they mentioned was Ramapithecus. Right, and here's the skull that they found way back in 1932, thought to be one of the earliest human ancestors. Well, what turned out to happen by the 1980s, which is to say by the time they were teaching me this in high school, paleontologists had already agreed that the Ramapithecus is just an orangutan. Nothing pre-human about it. But in school, they were still telling me something different. Takes a while for that stuff to trickle down, right? Because what tends to happen in paleontology is these ideas of pre-human hominins or other transitional fossils between this form and this form, they're trumpeted in the media, but they're based on just fragmentary evidence, just a few bones quite often. Not like you have a whole skeleton. And then there's a lot of speculation involved. And of course the media loves to run with that. And what often happens is more research gets done and we find out, okay, no, it's not actually what we thought it was. And then the retraction gets published on page 47 in some journal that nobody reads. And the rest of us go along believing the stuff they taught us in high school. Most evolutionists I know believe evolution on the basis of things they learned in school that have since been retracted or refuted. Maybe somebody here has heard about Piltdown Man. That was thought to be a perfect missing link, a transition between human and ape, discovered in 1912. And often what happens with these things is somebody creates an artist's rendition of what they think that this thing may have looked like. So this is what somebody thought Piltdown Man might have looked like with skin on it. Well, about 40 years later, it was revealed that Piltdown Man was a hoax. Somebody had taken the jaw of an orangutan and fused it onto a human skull, filed the teeth down. It was a hoax. It wasn't even real. But you know, it took 40 years to reveal that, to figure that out. How many people, I wonder, believed evolution in the meantime based on something that wasn't even real? Around the same time, Nebraska Man was publicized from 1910 based on a single tooth found in Nebraska. And from that, some artist at the Illustrated London News published a rendering of what they thought Nebraska Man might have looked like, based on a tooth. That's some imagination right there. Well, this one didn't take quite as long. It only took a few years for paleontologists to realize this wasn't real either, because that tooth was a pig's tooth. Not human, not even an ape. And they went off in the left field. Now they retracted that, but again, a number of people started believing evolution on account of that. Others have come and gone. There have been many of these, hominins that have been put forward. One category is Homo Erectus, which includes things like Java Man and Peking Man that have been found in different parts of the world. Very human-like in appearance. Different, maybe a little bit of a difference in the size of the brain cavity, but not very, too far different from Homo sapiens either. And again, here's a representation of what someone thought a Homo erectus may have looked like, right? Very, very human-like, but still, some kind of ape-like features there as well. Well, more research has been done over the years, and many paleontologists now agree that Homo erectus was probably just a human. Had a little bit different features, but we know that they're intelligent, they knew how to sail, they were capable of speech, and some of the differences in their body, as far as we know from the remains, really not that far different from Homo sapien. So very likely just other humans, a variation of humans that happened after the flood. I mean, you look around today, there's a wide variety of sizes and shapes of human beings, even in our time. From the Robert Wadlows of the world that was, 8 foot 11 feet tall in the early 20th century to others that are quite short, right? So what would happen if you found those remains? Right? Would you consider one to have evolved into the other? No, they're both modern humans. And maybe you heard about Neanderthal. Who's heard of Neanderthal? Right? That's a word that's often even equated with some kind of pre-human, brutish, ape-like creature that grunts and just isn't very smart at all, carries a club, right? This was discovered way back in 1829, and you could see that sloped brow, right? You could see the shape of that skull. And here's a representation, again, what an artist thought Neanderthal might have looked like. Very, very ape-like. Well, more research has happened since then. We've discovered a lot of things about Neanderthal that defy that interpretation. We find that Neanderthal could actually make and use tools. They had burial rituals for their dead. Odd thing for an ape-like creature to do. They had evidence of body decoration and use of cosmetics. They had controlled use of fire, which we didn't believe before. We find that Neanderthal were able to make dwellings out of timbers and skins. They didn't just live in caves, probably specific reasons they lived in caves at different times. And they could make musical instruments, cooking utensils. They even had a way of making glue, right? We discovered hyoid bone, which is something in the throat that's related to being able to speak. If you have one, you can speak. And DNA studies have shown that they interbred with modern humans. There's more and more DNA studies showing that things like Neanderthals, the Denisovans that we've been told are pre-human, a different species, and ancestors of ours, that they actually coexisted with modern humans and interbred with modern humans. Now, I heard about a lady who did one of those DNA tests, found out she had Neanderthal DNA in her lineage. She was horrified because of that old image that she thought about Neanderthal. No. Neanderthals are only human. They're just humans. The sloped brow and everything, hey, probably just happened. It's possible that some of the early remains, some of those examples were people who had rickets, vitamin D deficiency, which affects the shape of the skull and the body shape and so on. There's people alive today that have a sloped brow ridge. There's one guy actually used to be a world boxing champion. He's over 6 feet tall. He's now an MP in Russia, and he's got that sloped brow. Dare you to call him a Neanderthal. More and more things. I said, here's the representation we used to see of something called Neanderthal. But now, because of everything scientists know, the representations are getting a lot more human. Yeah, he's still wearing furs and everything, but very much a guy. Give him a shave. Put a suit on, put them on the subway. You look like everybody else, right? Computer imaging, testing has been done on certain remains, and there was one called Wilma a few years ago, and they came up with a representation of what they thought Wilma, a Neanderthal, looked like. That's pretty different from the other one, wasn't it? Here's a Neanderthal child. Yeah, there's nothing ape-like there. These are just humans. What we tend to find as we examine these hominins over time is eventually we end up concluding they're either fully ape or they're fully human. There really isn't much in between. Now, some evolutionists still are looking for some of those in-betweens, but they're struggling to find them. In fact, there's more and more evidence that a lot of these hominins coexisted, so they couldn't be ancestral to one another. I want to finish off with Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy for short. Lucy was the name ascribed to the first specimen found by Donald Johanson in 1974. You may have heard the story. It was big news. Of course, they told it to me in history class. This what appeared to be an ape-like creature, quite short, but who could walk upright. Right, so considered an early ape-like ancestor to human beings. Here's a representation of Lucy in a museum. See how she's kind of jaunting along, right? Bright-eyed, probably thinking about calculus or something. Yeah. You see the feet? Look at the feet. Very human, right? Kind of hairy, but very human feet. Right? The idea is that Lucy could walk upright. Problem is, they never actually found Lucy's feet. That's what they found of Lucy. About 40% of a skeleton, which actually is quite a bit normally for, finding fossils. The way they determined, there was two reasons they determined that Lucy could walk upright. Most of the bones indicated she's basically an ape, right? That's what Australopithecine means. But there's two reasons they thought she walked upright. One was the way they shaped the hip bones. Depending on how the hip bones are shaped determines how you're able to walk, whether it's kind of side to side like an ape or upright and straight ahead like a human. Well, the guy that did the reconstruction of the hips, because they were kind of busted up, guess which one he chose? Yeah, we got a DVD downstairs that shows that video clip. So there was that, plus there were some footprints found in a place called Laetoli, about 1,000 miles away from where Lucy was found. Found in some volcanic ash, and you can see these footprints. Again, everybody has agreed that have studied these are human footprints. Very human-like. Looks like, parent and child here maybe. Well, we talked about radiometric dating briefly. They did radiometric dating on the ash to date it, and it came up with 3.3 million years old. Now, we already know there's issues with those dating methods and the assumptions. So, if you consider the evolutionary timeline, the reasoning is there were no humans around that long ago, so those footprints must have been made by an earlier creature like Lucy. There's the logic. Here's Lucy's remains. We find some footprints we think are about the same age. Lucy walked upright. More research goes on. We learn more things about Lucy. Other specimens of Afarensis have been found. Found some of the feet. Found a locking wrist bone, which is consistent with knuckle walkers. Less and less indication that Lucy was able to walk upright at all. In fact, recent re-examination of the original fossils that were found, there's a bone here that amongst the remains actually belongs to a baboon. It's like, shouldn't have even been there, right? But that was part of the original remains study. So again, we find out that Australopithecines, really basically just apes. And every hominin that's ever been put forward, there's been dispute amongst evolutionists about whether or not it's a transition or not. There's really no consensus at all, and no direct lineage. Here's an interesting quote from Bernard Wood in New Scientist magazine. He said, "There is a popular image of human evolution that you'll find all over the place. On the left of the picture, there's an ape. On the right, a man. Between the two is a succession of figures that become ever more like humans. It's a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let it go, but it's an illusion." Yeah, that's not real at all. Basically, those in-betweens are not in-betweens. It's not a direct line. Evolutionists that hold on to those hominins say those are on different branches of the evolutionary tree, but there's no real direct ancestry at all. So there's less and less evidence. Maybe at some point you heard the idea that human and chimp DNA is about 98 or 99% the same. Right? That's been put forward. I saw that in National Geographic very recently. Right? This idea of 2% difference. Well, that's based on some early examination of chimp and human DNA, not even full genomes at the time, back in the 1970s. Now, way back in the 50s, J.B.S. Haldane determined that even if there was just a 1 or 2% difference, there hasn't been enough time to get enough beneficial mutations in the DNA to actually cause an ape-like creature to come and become a human. That's called Haldane's dilemma. It's never been solved. But more recent studies on DNA have shown that there's probably about a 13% difference in the sections of the immune systems of the two species. That the chimpanzee genome was actually 12% larger than the human. That's going to affect the percentages. Truth is, most paleontologists now understand there's at least a 5% difference in the DNA. Some would suggest even as high as 13 to 17%. That's quite a bit bigger difference. Not that it would really matter that much anyway, because a small difference in the DNA, that's actually quite a few letters. So that idea has been debunked a long time ago, but as I said, you may still come across that in the media. Take a look at what it says in Acts 17. Paul said, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth," going back to God created man in his own image, and we're all descended from Adam and Eve. Not this. Now I'm going to get into a touchy subject here for a minute, because this is important. Take a look at that representation. That goes back to the 1960s, I might add. Take a look from left to right. Do you notice a gradual shift in the skin tone? Sorry, guys, that's not by accident. This idea that folks of certain ethnicity are less evolved than others, that goes all the way back to Darwin. It's one of the early ideas in evolution. Now, evolutionists don't talk about this anymore. They try to get away from that because of the politics. And it's a really hot topic right now, especially in the U.S., right? So please understand, I'm not subscribing to this idea at all, but please understand this is part of evolutionary history, right? This idea that people evolved in different places at different times from different pre-human hominins, which led to the conclusion that some were less evolved than others. Take a look at the title of Darwin's original book, On the Origin of a Species by Means of Natural Selection. Look at the subtitle. Or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Yeah, Darwin thought like that. Darwin was an Englishman. And Darwin thought of himself as being a little more civilized than some of the tribes that were being contacted in different parts of the world by missionaries that were still hunting and still living in the jungle and so forth, and not in cities. And so that affected his thinking. In fact, here's a quote from that book. This is a quote from The Descent of Man a few years later. At some future period, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as at present between the Negro or the Australian and the gorilla. Ouch. Yeah, that was his thinking. And it permeated evolutionary thought in scientific circles for a number of years. Research was even done on people from different people groups to try to research what they thought were less than human. Here's a quote from Scientific American in 1904. Even today, ape-like Negroes are found in the gloomy forest who are doubtless direct descendants of those early types of man who probably closely resembled their simian ancestors. Whew. Talking about 1904, here's a headline from 1906. Bushman shares a cage with Bronx Park's apes. Some laugh over his antics, but many are not pleased. Well, they're not pleased because this Bushman, his name is Oda Benga, is a pygmy from the Belgian Congo. And somebody brought him over to the U.S. to be studied because they considered him to be a human ancestor. And they put him on display in a cage with an orangutan, some other creatures. Youch. And this was done in the name of science, guys. All right? Now, some were definitely not pleased with this, including a preacher from New York City who really didn't like the idea of that. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that all racism has to do with evolution, all right? There's always been people who have looked down on different people groups for whatever reason. In fact, sometimes people have even misinterpreted sections of the Bible to try to fuel those ideas because they've simply misinterpreted some things. But evolution added fuel to the fire, as it were. Stephen Jay Gould once noted, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Basically gave racists a scientific excuse to say, oh, hey, this is science. And it hasn't completely gone away. Even in scientific circles, I come from Exeter, near London, Ontario, which is the home of the University of Western Ontario. Some of you may have heard of the controversy there from the late 80s. A fellow named Dr. Philip Rushton and his research that was published caused a huge uproar. Here's a comment on Dr. Rushton's paper from Professor Barry Mailer. According to Rushton, blacks, according to Rushton, have larger genitals, making them more promiscuous, and smaller brains, making them less intelligent than whites and Asians. Using 60 different measures, Rushton ranks the races along an evolutionary scale, with blacks at the bottom and Asians at the top. 1989. Now, he was denounced, of course, across the scientific community, but this is what he thought, and this is what he thought from his research and his understanding of evolution. Of course, we know none of that is even remotely true because we are all created in the image of God. So then the question becomes, well, okay, how do you get all of this diversity? Right? How does that even happen? Some of you may have seen this picture before. There's a pair of twins with their mom and dad, right? Now, if you saw those girls in the street, would you think right away they're twins? But they are, right? They're very much twins. And, we dig into this story and we find out, well, what is it that causes skin color to be what it is? It has nothing to do with any evolutionary past. It simply has to do with a pigment called melanin. And we've all got it. right? Except for the albinos, everybody's got a little bit or a lot of melanin. And it's the thing that causes your skin color to be very, very light or very, very dark, depending how much melanin you can produce. And that's all dependent on your genetics and what's passed down to you. Because skin color, as well as some other traits, it's coded in your genes. And, of course, you get different variations of those genes available from mom and dad through their DNA. Now, in this case, mom and dad each had different variations of this melanin gene, so they could pass on either a very little bit of melanin or a lot. And this square here gives us an indication of the combinations that can come from just each parent having two different variations of that gene, depending on which ones are inherited by each child and the variations you can get. You can get a wide range of concentrations of melanin or skin color in one generation. Imagine the genetic diversity available in Adam and Eve over time, right? Obviously, over time, there's all kinds of variation. And melanin has to do with things like hair color and eye color as well. All of these different things are in our DNA. They have nothing to do with evolution. Here's another example of a pair of twins, right? But they're about 15 or 2015. Not the same two girls. This is another example of the same thing. You see, it was once thought that, things like differences, obvious differences like skin color must have taken a long time to develop. But the reality is that there's only a 0.2% difference in the DNA of any two human beings in the world. And yet we get tremendous diversity, right? And out of that, only 6% of that 0.02% has anything to do with what are called racial differences, like skin color and eye and so forth. Right? So very, very tiny, tiny difference. DNA studies have come to the same conclusion that the Bible came to a long time ago. Scientists at the National Institutes of Health recently announced that they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome, and the researchers had unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Hey, guess what? The Bible knew that a long time ago. And yet, like I say, we have all this wonderful diversity. So, where does this fit in biblical history? I mean, you think, okay, Adam and Eve, what color were they? What happened over time? Let's go to Genesis 11. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. You may have heard this story. Right? Noah's descendants were told to spread out and subdue and fill the earth, but they didn't. They all congregated around the plains of Shinar, and they built this tower and refused to obey God. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. So you've got Adam and Eve here originally, and all of their descendants, probably a good deal of diversity in different places perhaps. Then you get this genetic bottleneck at the flood with just Noah and his family there. And then within the next 100 to 200 years, his descendants all congregate in one area, and they're probably all marrying back and forth and trading genetic information throughout that group, which is to say it's a good chance that there were a lot of similarities in that group. Probably a fairly even skin tone. But then God confuses their language, and they're forced to separate from one another. They isolate from one another. And what happens when you do that? When you take a gene pool and separate it into smaller groups and isolate from one another, certain traits get lost in different groups. Some traits get lost while others become more dominant. So historically here, probably you had one group that had a large preponderance of melanin, a lot of dark-skinned folks. And so they didn't maybe have a chance to intermarry with somebody with a little bit of melanin. While over here you got a group that has very little melanin, perhaps they didn't have as much chance to intermarry with someone else. And so then over time you end up with these different people groups that take on different traits. And incidentally, melanin has certain beneficial properties. It blocks out UV rays, as we know, right? It blocks out things that, harsh effects from the sun that can cause skin ulcers and a number of other things. So if you happen to live in a place where there's a lot of harsh sunlight, it's a good idea to have lots of melanin. On the other hand, it also happens to block out vitamin D from the sun. So if you live in a place where there's less sunlight, say Europe, it's a good idea to have less of it because you can absorb more vitamin D. So you can kind of think, how these different people groups thrived in different places simply because of genetics. Nothing to do with evolution at all, but all related to one another. If we were all to come back together and intermarry back and forth like it was then, I suspect we'd see a lot of evening out of physical traits and a lot more genetic information. See, in my lineage, for example, we've lost the capacity to produce lots of melanin a long time ago, right? That would have to come in from some other line now. That's how different traits get isolated in different populations. Going back to the Bible, Genesis 10 tells us about those different people groups that migrated to different places, the grandsons of Noah. And this chart here gives a kind of a different view of the different descendants and the general areas they went to at that time. And we can actually track the names of Noah's grandsons through the Bible and through other history. We can track their descendants and the relation to nations and languages that came later. How under Japheth you get the Medes and you get the Galatians and Ukraine all come from Japheth. Ham, you've got Egypt. Mizraim is used in the Bible to refer to Egypt. Canaan, all of those Canaanite tribes, that nations that gave Israel such a hard time when they came to the Promised Land. And then Shem, you've got the Aramaic, you've got Syria. Here's an interesting word that comes up a couple of places here. It's the word Iran, which is actually related to a word Aryan. Y'all probably heard the word Aryan before in some 20th century history. But they're actually, interrelated, those lines, right? You might remember the idea that this fella had, developing this perfect Aryan pure race as he thought of it. He would be very surprised to know that the Aryans really descend primarily from Japheth, but also from Shem. They're Semites. That's pretty surprising to a guy that considered Semites and Jews and so forth to be inferior. Too bad he didn't know a little bit more of that history. I think we all know the infamy of Hitler and the Nazis and some of the nasty things they did. Also, actually, somewhat in the name of science in a certain degree. Sir Arthur Keith pointed this out. He said, "The German Führer, as I have consistently maintained, is an evolutionist. He has consciously sought to make the practice of Germany conform to the theory of evolution." He took Darwin's ideas and tried to apply that to his culture by eliminating the ones he thought were less fit. Comes from a notion called eugenics, which also has its roots in Darwinian evolution. It says here, eugenics arose out of the Darwinian theory of evolution and attempted to apply that theory to mankind. Right? Makes perfect sense. Kind of like that guy with the gun that thought he could improve the human race by getting rid of the ones he thought were less fit. Now, people who came up with eugenics maybe didn't imagine what Hitler was going to do, and yet what he did do was rather logical from that line of thought. All right, so much for all that nasty stuff. Let's talk about language. We'll finish off with this. One of the conundrums that evolutionists have, if we evolved from ape-like creatures, how did we develop language? How did you go from this very simple system of grunts and a few gestures, very basic communication, to the sophisticated, detailed language that all humans share? Evolutionists can't explain that transition. Linguist Noam Chomsky pointed this out. He said, "The deepest structures of language are innate, not learned. We are all born with the same fundamental grammar hardwired into our brains, and we are pre-programmed to pick up the additional rules of the local language. Evolve that. It's already innate. It's already in us. We're designed for language. Another a population geneticist here said, children are born with the propensity and ability to learn a language. It requires a precise anatomical and neurological foundation. Nobody knows how that could possibly transition from an ape-like creature. He also said most language families appear to have developed during a brief period between 6 and 25,000 years ago. Now, I would certainly have issue with the timeline there, right? But 6,000 to 25,000. I'd say probably a little bit less than that. But you notice he's saying all language families. See, linguists understand that of all the many dialects in the world, they can all be categorized within a group of language families that are very similar within each language. Probably about 20 or maybe a couple of dozen families of languages. And of course, the older languages are actually more complex than the more modern languages that have developed from them. But within those families, there's similarities. Between those families, there's no similarity at all. Well, that might make sense in a biblical history. See, for the evolutionists, everything had to somehow start from one language, from an ape-like creature. But they don't understand how that's possible. Biblically, you start at creation, and nobody really knows what the first language was that was created or what they spoke in the plains of Shinar. Nobody really knows that. But then people get dispersed, and now they have different languages. Makes sense now that there's groups of languages not similar to one another. Backs up biblical history again. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. All right. I've mentioned several resources along the way. One Human Family is a great book by Carl Whelan that really digs deep into this whole question of different so-called races and the genetics behind that, and even gets in behind some of the logic where some of these racist ideas have actually come from. Great book to study if you want to get into that topic. And I mentioned Icons of Evolution, Lucy and Friends, an examination of a number of those hominins I talked about before, including that little video of the guy reconstructing Lucy's hips. Contested Bones is a one. There isn't a single hominin specimen that's not under contention amongst evolutionists. There's no consensus there. If you really want to know some of the truth behind the sensationalized stories, you can get that book. Dr. Jonathan Sarfati examines the link between evolutionist thinking and which led to the Holocaust in World War II. And then, of course, I mentioned the Creation Answers book several times, and there's several chapters there on some of the topics we've covered. Wow, we've talked about a lot of stuff, or at least I have. Now, I would recommend at this point we take maybe just a quick 5-minute break, get a drink of water. If you got to go, if you got to, God bless you. Resources are still available. And then give me a little bit of a breather, and we'll come back here in about 5 minutes and spend what's left of our time in a little bit of Q&A for those who would like to stay.